The worst thing that can happen to the human race is not energy depletion, economic collapse, or conquest by a totalitarian government. The one process that will take millions of years to correct is the loss of species diversity by the destruction of natural habitats. This is the folly our descendants are least likely to forgive us. E.O. Wilson, 1980. Each organism on the planet, whether it flies, swims, blossoms, or walks erect, is closely tied to a location where particular conditions prevail. This location is its habitat. In one way or another, plants and animals are being deprived of the habitats to which they are adapted.
Oh, give me a home where the buffaloes roam, and the deers and the antelopes play, and the rabbits, where seldom is hoid or discouraged.
The worldwide destruction of habitats is causing the extinction of species. In America, we have eliminated 80% of the virgin forests, wetlands, and prairies, and countless species within them.
I have a sense of urgency that we need to get the answer to the question of what are we doing to the environment by reducing the diversity as rapidly as we're doing.
250,000 people are added to the world population each day. They have to eat, they use resources, they use paper, they want a space to live, and with all this resource use, especially in the United States, but in other countries too, whether rich or poor, you use land, you use ecosystems, and net result is tremendous devastation, extinction wherever you look.
In the age of the dinosaur, the Earth lost about one species every 1,000 years. We are now losing species at the rate of 1 per day. It is predicted that in the next 3 decades, 15 to 20% of all forms of life now on Earth will no longer exist. There is a growing awareness that when we lose a species forever, we lose more than beauty, more than a living companion on the planet. We lose resources that may be crucial to our survival.
It's my feeling that industry should be one of the primary supporters of conservation in this world, because what is disappearing is basically their long-range economic insurance. The substances that we have yet to discover are substances upon which business can become dependent.
I'm Tony the Tiger, and for years I've been saying Kellogg's Sugar Frosted Flakes are great, but I'll bet you don't even know what they're made of.
Corn, the single most important food crop in the United States. It has been developed from wild plants taken from natural habitats and crossbred for maximum quality. The result is that each corn plant is nearly identical. If one is susceptible to a disease or change in climate, they all are.
North American corn is based on 5 or 6 major lines of inbreds only. And if any of those get sick, we'll have a catastrophe like the 1970 corn blight.
In 1970, a fungal blight overwhelmed the corn crop, devastating it in much the same way that blight destroyed the Irish potato crop 150 years ago. The damage in the U.S. was over $5 billion. In order to prevent future disaster, scientists have been searching for disease-resistant varieties to breed with the domestic crop. The ideal plant is a perennial relative. Rooted in the same place year after year, it develops an immunity to pests and disease.
So whenever you find a perennial ancestor of a cultivated plant, you can expect a very high level of disease resistance to fungi, to viruses, and even to insects.
In 1976, Hugh Iltis sent a Christmas card to his botany friends around the world, saying that a rare perennial corn, not seen in the wild since 1917, was extinct. Although this variety was unable to breed with domestic corn, it had high research value. Rafael Guzman, a Mexican student, found what he thought was the lost corn in the mountains of southwestern Mexico. He sent samples of the seeds to Iltis, who discovered that it wasn't the lost corn at all, but an entirely new species that could be bred with domestic corn. It is Zea diploperennis, commonly called teosinte.
We also knew instantly we had something terribly important and very, very exciting, and we planned within an hour, we planned to go to Mexico. For 10, 11 hours, we were slowly trudging our way up through the cloud forest. I was getting terribly anxious. I wanted to know what was this plant like. And eventually we got to the top. Raphael yelled, "Here it is!" And I looked around and there were hundreds of plants. And I got off my mule, took a pickaxe, and started digging around. And the minute I looked at those roots, I knew instantly that this was very different. And I turned to Raphael and said, "By God, this is a different species." My heart was just beating. I couldn't even speak. And Raphael, of course, was beaming from ear to ear. We had found one of the great discoveries of this century. So here we have teosinte, a plant that is basically worthless. Oh, well, I mean, a cow will eat it, but beyond that, you know, you couldn't convince anybody that this is of any value. And yet, teosinte is immune to 7 of the 9 major viruses in the world. If we get virus resistance into the corn crops of the world and increase the world corn production by 1% only, you are talking about $400 million a year saving.
Would Noah have recognized the hidden value in teosinte? A modern-day Noah would have to save more than 2 of every creature. He would have to save samples of the plants, the insects, the microorganisms, and the soil itself from every habitat on Earth.
Our conservation effort is in some ways misguided. If you think of the condor, if you think of the golden eagle, if you think of the elephants, these are the species which by virtue of size we're familiar with. And granted, these are species that have to be preserved, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole scale that extends down to the tiniest little things in the soil. They too have an intrinsic value.
This is one of the last uncut beech hemlock forests in the United States. Located in upstate New York, it is habitat for the Polyzonia millipede, a species with unusual chemical properties.
And one of the interesting things about it, if you just handle it gently, it responds as if it were attacked by an enemy, say a raccoon or a spider or a group of ants. And it gives off a very strong odor of camphor. But the compound turned out to be something very different from camphor. It turned out to be a substance very different from any other compound identified from an animal, and turned out to be a substance that is a very powerful insect repellent. Take a droplet of this material and you'd approach an insect with it and immediately leaves and then begins scratching. The material is irritating to the surface of an insect. One of the reasons we need to preserve this millipede is we would want to preserve the genes that are responsible for producing this insect repellent. Because ultimately, one may be able to transfer that gene, and with it, the ability to produce that chemical, to another organism.
Each species is an aggregate of genes coded to signal every detail of the species' performance. Recent discoveries in genetic research have changed the power of a gene. If the gene for a specific characteristic, the release of repellent odors, for example, can be located within a species' chromosomes, it may be possible to transfer that characteristic to a completely unrelated species. Domestic crops could acquire the millipede's ability to repel insect pests.
I don't know how to preserve this millipede in the laboratory. I have to maintain it in nature in order to be able to work on it. You see, it is part of that natural habitat, which if it were to disappear, probably would result in the disappearance of the species.
In the case of teosinte, it survived only on the Sierra de Manantlan in 3 little localities. And any 10 healthy cows at any one of these spots could very easily just graze there for a week and wipe it out. And if we want to preserve this species, we have to preserve the nature in which it evolved, to which it is adapted. It's like an eagle. You can hold an eagle in a zoo. Fine. Kids can look at it and say, look, Ma, there's an eagle. But how often is an eagle going to breed in the Madison Zoo? An eagle needs its environment. And teosinte species absolutely has to have its own environment. And this is why nature preservation is so tremendously important. Without preservation, you cannot preserve most species.
Preserving plants and animals in their natural habitat turns out to be the simplest way. As soon as we start moving them into a greenhouse or a zoo, then there are responsibility. Keeping them depends on expending energy, the attentions of people for decades, centuries, thousands of years. They don't just maintain themselves free of charge as they do in nature, and if there's any lapse in the human society that supports them, then they're finished.
Greenhouses are not exactly natural habitats. Many people look upon wild nature as full of weeds. And I've heard this question many times. I discuss some rare or interesting species, and somebody in the audience will say, well, what good is it? Well, my answer to that usually is, what good are you?
The Pine Barrens of New Jersey, a vast habitat of oaks, cedars, and pines rooted in a soil more than half composed of sand. Researchers from Squibb Laboratories have come to take soil samples from this habitat since a discovery here in 1978. They were looking for a substance that could replace penicillin as an antibiotic. Virulent bacteria have developed a resistance to that one-time miracle drug. What Squibb found in the Pine Barren soil was a bacterium that produced a molecule with a structure never before seen.
It turned out that this was a very fascinating discovery. This was a novel beta-lactam antibiotic like penicillins and cephalosporins, but a different structure, which has led to a whole new family of antibiotic molecules called monobactams.
The discovery has led to new treatments for meningitis, gonorrhea, and hospital infections that affect more than 1 million people a year in the United States alone.
The value to industry of naturally produced molecules is certainly in the area of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. For example, penicillin is a naturally occurring molecule. All penicillins that are sold on the market today, all cephalosporins, in fact the large majority of antibiotics, and that's a $10 billion market, are actually naturally occurring molecules.
What was found in the Pine Barren soil may save the lives of millions. Almost half of all medical prescriptions are derived from nature, yet only 2% of the world's plant and animal species have even been investigated for their chemical properties. Habitats on land and beneath the sea harbor species entirely unknown to us. Piece by piece, the original America is vanishing, and with it, natural laboratories that cannot be reclaimed. A century ago, One such laboratory stretched from Canada to the Mexican border.
400 million acres. The Great Plains seemed inexhaustible. Yet in 50 years, we turned a part of it into a dust bowl. We put too many cattle and sheep in it. We granted homesteads of rangeland that never should have been plowed. We tore up grass for war needs. We invented new machinery, making it possible for one man cheaply to plow thousands of acres. An unprecedented drought completed the habit. There was no grass left to hold the light soil against the high wind.
By the 1930s, there was so little left of the American prairie that an attempt was made to recreate it in Madison, Wisconsin.
What happened here was the development of a prairie to let future generations know what the prairie was like. The plants were put in one species at a time, the Indian grass, the goldenrod, the blazing star, and others. Work in the prairie involved much heat, much wind, much perspiration. Sometimes your back was covered with mosquitoes. It just requires much devotion to the project in order to stay with it. Nobody knows how long it would take to establish a prairie, but one guess is that it may be as much as 1,000 years.
This abandoned farm field is now the Curtis Prairie. Civilian Conservation Corps workers labored for 3 years, placing thousands of seedlings in this 60-acre plot. Yet the Curtis is not a genuine prairie. It does not have the diversity of life once found on the Great Plains. Now, only 0.1% of the original prairie remains. It is found only in places that have been set aside and where the plow has not reached. Natural habitats all over the world are being replaced by a narrow range of cultivated species that fulfill our immediate needs. But as diversity is lessened, future options for discovery are eliminated. In the Florida Panhandle, vast stretches of pine plantations are a sharp contrast to the few remaining areas of natural vegetation. The bluffs and ravines along the Apalachicola River, just 45 miles west of Tallahassee, are virtually undisturbed.
The very nature of the ravines are what saved them from being greatly disturbed. It's very expensive to come in and forest and log steep slopes like this. The little things in here are the ones that are very rare and the ones that are very unique because they can evolve down in the creek bed where things don't change very much over time.
The area is a 2,000-acre natural sanctuary. Species that are rare elsewhere are found in abundance here. Many of these species sought refuge here during the Ice Age and stayed on when the temperature rose, protected by the constant 70-degree temperature of the streams and the shade of the high tree canopy. As in all habitats, the interactions between plants, animals, soil, water, and air cannot be duplicated. A local lawyer once claimed that this site fit the description in the Bible of the first habitat on Earth. Since then, it has been known as the Garden of Eden.
That Garden of Eden site and the adjacent area along the Apalachicola River has more biotic richness than any other place in the United States. There are animals and plants found there, and not only nowhere else in Florida, but very interestingly, nowhere else in the world. And it's been threatened by the proposal to build a power plant facility there.
A power plant like this one, under construction 120 miles to the east, has been proposed for the Garden of Eden site. It would be a 1,200 megawatt coal-fired facility occupying 500 acres of land.
A power plant of this size requires up to 2,000 workers at a peak just for construction of the plant, and that's over maybe a 4-year period. Then there are spin-off economic benefits at a plant like this just from the spending in the community and so forth. Ultimately, you have maybe 250 permanent employees there, and the tax base represented by a $1.5 billion project is many, many times over what the tax base there is right now.
The power plant would triple the tax base and would not disturb the county too greatly. It would not bring in too many people, and it would give jobs to Liberty County without greatly disturbing the county.
Bristol, Telogia, and the other small towns of the Florida Panhandle are the habitat for the human population that survives on the boundaries of this garden. For years, the economy has been fueled by the pine plantations. But jobs are scarce now. The demand for timber is down. The community welcomed the plans for a power plant in the Garden of Eden.
We need the jobs. We got the people and we've got the area, but we don't have the jobs.
Like my father and I, we work 15, 16 hours a day just to make ends meet, you know, and if we had a little bit of industry in this county, more trucks came through and more people needed, you know, worked on, and I think we could probably make it.
The power plant, if located in the uplands along these steepheads and ravines, would totally alter the ecosystem in which these plants live. It would cut off the flow of natural groundwater which feeds the streams and causes the unique environment.
The indigo snake, a threatened species, lives in the sandy hills above the ravines and moves down to the stream beds to feed. The garden is the southern limit of the copperhead. It survives on the great variety of salamanders and frogs that, in turn, are nurtured by the richness of insect life. The Terrea taxifolia, a conifer once used in the building of ships, is now limited to a handful of individual trees, nearly all in the Garden of Eden. This variety of dusky salamander may live nowhere else on Earth.
There's a certain class of people that want to keep this county in the woods and then, you know, keep it, you know, a nature lover's place. And I think every day it's growing to be a larger number that wants to bring in industry.
Industrial growth and jobs are important. The country could not survive without them. But the location of industrial development is optional. It's not critical to any one given area. And in that respect, the steepheads and ravines are more important than industrial development.
We can only speculate on what untouched habitats like the Garden of Eden have to offer. New pesticides from rare trees, antibiotics from the soil, cancer cures from the cells of creatures yet to be discovered. But all natural habitats cannot be saved. Priorities for preservation must be made.
This program is the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. The overall purpose is to get as much information as possible on those species and communities that are the rarest or are the most threatened. There's not very much of them left, so we need to protect what there is or we're going to lose it.
The Natural Areas Inventory takes the biological census of a region. What species are there? Where do they survive? Are they healthy or dying? Common or rare? Planners draw on this data bank when making decisions about development.
This particular site was proposed for an electric power generating station. So Suzanne and other people in the inventory went over to their meetings and identified the types of species that existed there and brought it to their attention that this was the only place that some of these species exist. So having that information available and getting it across to the power company is what helped them make the decision that this was not a good location to put a power plant.
We looked at the situation as a mix of factors that we weighed, and that we felt that when we looked at all of these factors, including the environmental factors, that the advantage rested with the other site.
The power plant will not be built in the Garden of Eden. A new site in Taylor County, 80 miles to the east, harbors no endangered species.
I'm very pleased that that they decided to locate, if it wasn't Liberty County, it was happened to be at least as close as Taylor County. I know some people in Taylor County, and I know that they worked as hard as we did for the power plant.
It was clearly a conflict here with a major new industry coming into an area that really needed to have the industry. The state needed to have the industry too. We needed the power plant, but from a statewide perspective, we didn't need it there.
There are natural sanctuaries all over the world. Rainforests, prairies, marshlands, and marine habitats are as precious as the Garden of Eden. These areas will be less likely to disappear if we become aware of their importance and act to save them.
I think the thing that has hit me the hardest in my involvement with this as both a man of industry and as a person interested in the natural sciences is that everything is intertwined with everything else. And the more that the people who have to make these decisions can understand that man is a creature of this habitat, that we cannot preserve it as if he did not exist, but on the other hand, he cannot trample on it in a way that ignores both the needs of other creatures and the needs of his own descendants generations later.
In a very real sense, all this diversity of life on Earth has a right to exist. They're our insurance that we will not end up on the Earth alone, that they will give us beauty, that will give us a sense of wonder, that we will not be caught in the large cities with cars and cows and concrete and corn and nothing else. If we really think that human life will continue, we owe it to our children that we leave them a rich and beautiful and diverse world. The time to preserve is now. Extinction is forever. It cannot wait.
The Nature Conservancy, a national conservation organization, secured $1 million in private contributions to acquire the Garden of Eden. The organization now owns and manages the area as a natural preserve.